I'm Heather, and this is the Living with Addiction podcast, where I show you how you have more power than you realize when it comes to helping yourself and your child that's struggling with addiction. Hey, everybody. I'm excited to have Dr. Carmen Jones and Coach Kimberly Jarman on the podcast today. First, because I think they're both amazing humans and I trust both of them. I trust Dr. Carmen with my physical health. I've been working with her since my breast cancer diagnosis, trying to optimize my health and my quality of life through this process. And I work with Kim on a regular basis on my mental health. We trade coaching a lot because I really appreciate Kim's no nonsense approach and knowing that we're going to easily get to the root cause of whatever thought is, the poisonous thought that's causing my problem. And I don't want anybody to sugarcoat anything for me. Like, I have plenty of people in my life I can turn to for that. So I really appreciate that Kim is always there to help me out with my mental health. So I really trust and admire both of these women. And second, I am excited because of what we're going to talk about. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is neurotransmitters and stress and the role that they play in addiction. And we're also going to talk about how thoughts affect our body physically. So I talk a lot about how thoughts create feelings, but I heard Dr. Carmen and Kim talking about actually what's behind how you feel because of your thoughts and how it actually physically affects your body on one of their podcasts. And I knew that I had to have them on here to talk about that as well, because it's just an important piece of the owner's manual. I think that we're missing, and we often wonder why we do the things that we do. And I think the more we know and understand these things, we can really help ourselves to, just have a little bit more compassion and acceptance for who we are so that we can also know how to move forward. And so that's my introduction for Kim and Carmen, but I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves and share what you want to share before we get started.
I'll let you go first, Carmen.
Sure. So I'm excited to be here. I'm Dr. Carmen Jones. I'm a naturopathic doctor. My approach to health and wellness and supporting folks on their journey to optimal health include looking at what is the root cause, what is the trigger that's causing our body not to be in that repairing and regenerative state. So my perspective is always trying to figure out where we can support the body the best so that it can be in that healing state, so that we can be working towards optimal health. So
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. And so I am Kimberly Jarman, and as Heather already told you guys, I'm a life coach. And I coach, Dr. Carmen and I have been business partners for a long time, it feels like. And I coach individuals that are high achievers that are wanting to up-level their life, not only from the mental health perspective, getting rid of those self-limiting beliefs, right? Overcoming all of their obstacles, but also from a neurotransmitter hormone level, so physical level. Because Dr. Carmen and I work together to do a neurohormone panel to see where they're at, the baseline, because we have to address both, like we're going to talk about in this podcast. We have to address what the biochemistry is doing, along with the neural pathways, your thoughts and your beliefs, because they're very much enmeshed in one another, and they're like a seesaw. They have to be balanced to actually really make great progress, I guess. Because I've noticed from being in the counseling field and being a patient, right? Like when only one is addressed, it's almost like you're working with a handicapped.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to do that test after my surgery when I'm done, like totally weaned off my hormones, and see what my baseline is so that we have a better so we know where to start, like how, and just we can continue to support quality of life. I think that's an important part of quality of life. So I love that you guys are doing that to help people. So let's start with the neurotransmitters and stress and the role they play in addiction. So from the standpoint, would it be better to start with the stress or the neurotransmitters? Like what's the chicken or the egg?
So I'd like to start with stress.
Okay, let's start
And then
there.
hopefully as we explore and get a better understanding of stress and how it overflows into the neurotransmitters.
Okay.
So most of this we're talking about the brain, right? We're talking about the brain changes. And so when we before I dive in, does your audience have a little bit of understanding of cortisol and the fight or flight reactions?
Probably not.
Okay.
Or let's just assume we don't, so that
Okay.
we have the best understanding possible.
Okay. So when our body, I'm going to lay down the foundation first then. So when we experience stress, okay, now stress is just an umbrella term for anxiety, fear, anger, irritability. I mean, all the things could be construed as stress. Stress is how we perceive it, right? But when we experience stress, whether that's emotional stress or physical stress, whether it's trauma or surgery or an accident, it doesn't matter. Our brain translates it the same way, and it produces that hormone called cortisol. And when we have an excess amount of cortisol, it makes a lot of physical changes in our body, right? What happens immediately is that our blood is shunted from our extremities to our core, so mostly to our heart and lungs. Because the idea is if we're experiencing stress, we're in that what we call the fight or flight stage. So your body's getting ready to run away from that tiger or go out and chase dinner, right? Mm-hmm. And so as it does that, it changes the blood flow. So we have less blood flow to our extremities, less blood flow to our gut, because our body says those aren't essential right now in this fight or flight stage, right? In relation to addiction, it also changes the blood flow in our brain, right? It changes the blood flow from that prefrontal cortex down to the amygdala into kind of like that primal brain, right? So that we can make quick decisions, but we're not making like fine motor decisions. We're not making critical thinking decisions. Those are hard to do when we're in that fight or flight.
Right? We're also making, sorry to interrupt you, Carmen. They're more instant gratification decisions, right? It's all about the here and now and getting out of the pain and suffering and to hell with our future.
Exactly.
Because your prefrontal cortex is basically shut down, right? At that point, like you can't access it when your emotions are high, your thinking and reasoning skills are low.
Exactly.
Yeah, you wouldn't need it, right? Like imagine a lion chasing you. Like right. Goal achievement is not on my brain.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So when we've looked at the changes that happen in our brain and that less critical thinking, there have been a couple of experiments, and I was trying to look up those references this morning, but and this is more sort of in the post-traumatic world of research. But what we've seen is, I'm going to explain a little bit of an experiment. They took two groups of monkeys, right? And they were baby monkeys, I think maybe 4 weeks old. And they took one group of monkeys and they took them away from their moms and they separated them away from their moms. And they measured their levels of cortisol and they did functional MRIs of their brain to see what brain changes occurred, right, in that stressful period. And then the other set of monkeys, they were with mom the whole time, right? They separated the baby monkeys from their mom, I think it was about 6 weeks. And then they did imaging again, and what they found is their amygdala significantly shrank, right? That we do see this in chronic stress. The gray matter in our brain and the amygdala, that primal brain, that fear center, shrinks over time due to chronic stress. Okay. And so in this experiment, they also wanted to see how resilient our brain could be. So then they reunited mom with the babies with baby monkeys with mom, and kept them together for 12 weeks, and then reevaluated and did imaging again. And what they found is that the brain changed. That amygdala began to get closer to the original size, but was so we could tell they were on recovery once they felt like they were in that safe space with mom, right? Post chronic stress. And so I wanted to share that for two reasons. One, as our brain changes due to chronic stress, yes, it lowers that threshold, right? That for better decisions, right? It lowers that threshold. So we're looking for that instant gratification because you don't want to feel bad, right? And secondly, when they looked at 12 weeks out after reunification, they could measure a difference in the brain growth, that it was getting better. It just wasn't quite where it was when they originally started, right? So that tells us, because of that neuroplasticity, our brain can change and recover from chronic stress, but it does take a little bit of time.
So what is when your amygdala shrinks, what problems does that cause?
So it causes things like
just the high level. We don't have to.
No, that's okay.
I don't want to start a rabbit hole.
So I've just got instant gratification stuck in my head. So you're making decisions that are impulse decisions. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a lot of impulsivity. Yeah. That occurs when that amygdala is smaller in size. It's a lot of decisions based on wanting to protect yourself, right? You're in survival mode. When that amygdala is shrunk, that's what we see in folks who've also experienced post-traumatic episodes, is that you're making decisions for survival. Yeah.
Okay, this is great, because from the kids' perspective, who are dealing with addiction, that's why our kids are so impulsive, because when they're using and they are going through withdrawals or something like that, they're definitely in survival mode. And then for the parents, this experience for us, if we don't know how to manage our own minds about it, is very traumatic. And so then we get stuck in survival mode, and we're struggling to use our prefrontal cortex to make the best possible decisions. And so that's why we get stuck repeating our own patterns as well, right?
And you guys move to a place of impulsivity as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's why a lot of parents talk about struggling to control their reactions to their kids and not feeling good about how they show up either.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like Dr. Carmen and I both believe in root causes, right? So chasing it back to the very start. And like, if you think of like, let's think of, is it politically correct to say addicts? It doesn't feel politically correct.
It is not politically correct, but it really is a struggle sometimes to come up with the right wording. So, probably somebody who has an addiction is more politically correct, but it is just hard to say those words every single time. So,
well, I'll say politically correct. People that struggle with addiction, right? Like if you look at like where that population starts, And a lot of times it's with teenagers, young teenagers, right? Well, it's super hard if we can all go back and remember to be a teenager. So we're already struggling with stress of being a teenager and living in junior high and high school, right?
Yeah.
And then you add on an event, divorce, like the list will go on, right? Like we're setting them up for this to some degree. And then you look at people that have an addiction later, there's always a correlated stressful event, like war. Like me and you were reading that book, like soldiers, like it's a super stressful event, right?
Right.
Like it's like you can always go back to like where was the highest level of stress, and it will correlate with the start of the addiction. I would guess. I've not done a research study on that.
I also want to add though, because as humans, we are always experiencing stress in some form or fashion, right? And it's a matter of how we cope with that stress, right? So if we look at families who have multiple siblings and they all go through a stressful event together, and some of those siblings end up in a path of addiction and some of those siblings don't, and you wonder why, what was different, right? They've done this with twin studies too, with twins who have the exact same genetics, right? So you can't say, oh, well, myself and my three, brothers and sisters, we all got a little bit of a different genetic patterns. But when they look at twins who have the same genetics, right? And one twin falls to addiction and one twin doesn't, they want to see, well, what is the difference? If they grew up in the same environment, right? The same environmental factors, the same genetic factors, and usually it comes to how they cope with stress, right? Our thoughts and our beliefs around stress or around that, event that leads them, to different paths.
So we each have natural coping mechanisms, but we can also learn healthier ones like we have through coaching.
Right.
Because they're mainly belief systems, right?
Yeah. Which we get when we are kids.
Right.
Yeah, at least the building blocks of that framework when we're younger. Yes.
Which I want to clarify because I can hear myself as a critic being like, if you have the same kids that have been taught by the same parents and they've been taught the same belief systems, right? But it's the individual's interpretation of the teachings that then they build onto their belief systems.
That's a great point. Okay, so now we've talked about the stress and the effect that it has on us. And then what's the next part of that?
Okay, so you can see how that stress and that impulsivity can set us up for making choices that, for survival. You're making choices for survival, right? And if that stress is around something that you just don't want to feel, Kim, you said it beautifully, is that you are choosing things that will make you feel a little bit better, right? Will get you that reward. So oftentimes, people will turn to things to kind of self-medicate, right? You'll turn to alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, heroin, cocaine, meth, people will turn to sugar for those things. So, it can be the whole gamut. And so as depending on what people use for substances, that directly affects our neurotransmitters, right? So when you're reaching for something that makes you feel good, that's where that dopamine surge comes from, right? That dopamine release that that people feel good, it's that reward. And so, of course, if you feel crummy all the time, like 90% of the time, you're going to want to make decisions or choose things that give you that little glimmer of hope, right? Like that little
glimmer of hope is a great way of saying it. Yes.
Yeah. So we see that pattern, right? We've talked about neuroplasticity and how our brain changes, but you're creating that pattern of that addictive behavior because you're like, hey, nothing else is giving me this hope or this feeling. So I'm going to keep going back to that substance, whether it's, I mean, yeah, you're in survival mode, so you don't really care if it's beneficial or not. Yeah. And so then you're creating those receptors to require more and more amounts of dopamine that's being released as a result of, yeah, that substance or the intake of that substance.
So we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, that that's why we see them using more and more, because you never get that same feeling that you get from that first high, because your body starts getting used to the flood of dopamine, and their response is to not be able to, I guess, absorb as much of it.
Right. So long term, so we see this in all addictions, even with alcohol and with cigarettes, right? And even with marijuana, even we see this in addiction, is that the more neurotransmitters your body release, your body will say, hey, okay, so now there's at the beginning, there's a excess, so we want to maximize that excess, so it will create more receptors that those neurotransmitters fit into that stimulate the response. And so over time your body, those receptors are there, that's part of that neuroplasticity, and so your body will crave, whatever it was, to create more of that response so that you can fill those receptors.
Like, let's say a normal person would only have 50. I'm just making up. Like someone that's not addicted has 50. Versus you do someone that struggles with addiction and they have 150 now.
Exactly.
So when you're trying to go back to that normal 50, then you've got 100 of them receptors that are like, hey, we're starving over here.
Yes. That's why those cravings can be so intense for folks, because it may take up to 4 weeks before those receptors begin to resolve, I guess, so that you can get closer to that 50 number again, right? When you go for at least 4 weeks without that stimulation, then you can get kind of, better numbers or less active receptors that are adding to those intense cravings.
So why does it take, because I've heard this before, and maybe I don't know if this is accurate or not, but for somebody who uses like heroin or meth, that it takes a year or two for them to really, their brain to get back to producing all of the neurotransmitters that make us feel so good, and that's part of the reason why they relapse so much. Is there more things happening for beyond that 4-week period?
Yes. So the more intense the substance, like, so heroin and cocaine don't just act on dopamine, they also act on our endorphins, and they act on some of our inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA. So it's not as black and white as it's just a dopamine picture, right? And so you're having to rebuild multiple things. I mean, heroin is so addicting, right? You can get addicted after just one use.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot more players involved, even with meth, to a certain extent. So let me backtrack a little bit. I guess 4 weeks is what we've seen in the research as far as like smoking and alcoholism, right? So maybe I should have put a caveat to that. I apologize. Than some of the other substances.
And you have to take into play the whole body, right? Like what has heroin done to the liver, the kidneys, the gut health, right? So that's why the journey is so long, is because the body's not only focusing on repairing the brain and the neurotransmitters, it has to divide its energy and start taking care of all these different pieces, right? So you can imagine if my energy is concentrated on one thing, I can heal it much faster. But if you've got me divided up into 50 different organs, the whole body system, it takes longer.
That totally makes sense. Okay, so that's why it takes so long for our kids when they are trying to get sober. They have so many different things happening in their body trying to repair itself, and it's happening in their brain. And then there's also the issue of gut health, which we're going to talk about at some point today as well. But I like knowing that, because as parents, we often ask ourselves, like, why? Why do they keep relapsing? Why does this keep happening? Why can't they just quit? And all of these things that we're discussing today are the reasons why. There's just so many factors that we don't really hear about on a regular basis. And I think that it's important for us to know this so we can have more compassion for what our kids are going through, and have other ways to support them and ourselves, and quit asking why they're doing it, but more like, how can I help them, support them and myself throughout this process? So, is there more that you want to share about neurotransmitters, or do you want to talk about gut health a little?
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah, of course.
So I think that this will also help with like compassion on their journey. Because I know like a lot of people, a lot of families get extremely angry at their kids for like stealing from them, or like, and we don't see it in the picture of addiction. We see it as like their character.
Yes.
Right? Like they're only bad people steal from their family. Right. And so then it's like this rub, because you don't want to believe your kid's a bad person. Society's saying they're a bad person. But if we can always go back to the physiology, like they're in survival mode, right? And survival says keep the organism alive at all cost. It's not that they're stealing from you because they're a bad human. It's their brain is, I have to survive. Like it's that animal instinct, right? And if we look at the animal kingdom, we don't label them bad for like murdering another like lion and eating it, right? It's like, they have to survive. And so we can remove the stigma of like bad people because they're stealing or doing all these other illegal behaviors to get what they need. It's just coming from a primal survival.
Yeah, I think I love that you made that point, because we tend to take it personally when our kids steal from us and wonder how they could possibly steal from us if they loved us. And if we keep that in perspective, that they are in survival mode, they're, making impulsive decisions, and they're living in this fight or flight, that we don't have to take it so personally. And it makes it easier to go into just setting boundaries and protecting ourselves, instead of constantly resisting it and thinking, well, they should just stop. Like, or, it's like, if I get in the water with a bunch of sharks, I know how sharks are going to behave. And so I'm really taking that risk. But when it comes to what our kids are doing, we just need to know that they're in survival mode. They're going to do anything that they can to survive. And so we have to protect ourselves. And then just one more reason to get rid of questioning everything, but just approaching it from the perspective of acceptance and being educated and understanding what's going on, and taking a lot of the emotion out of it to have a sustainable, effective approach that actually works for everybody involved.
Yeah. Because it would be insanity, Heather, if you went and swam with the sharks and you're like, look, you need to not eat me. You need to do this for one, right? Like, you're crazy at that point, right? Like,
well, we've already decided that parents, we aren't making the best decisions either, right? Because we're in fight or flight. We're in fear for our children's life and safety. And so we're making impulsive decisions and getting stuck in the vicious loop of doing the same things over and over again because we can't engage our prefrontal cortex to make good decisions. And so I think that's why I love educating like this, because it really can help us move out of that living in that fight or flight mode ourselves. When we're in it, it's hard to see because we can't engage our prefrontal cortex to see what's happening or to reason with the situation at all.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And one more point I wanted to make is like, I think it's very important, like when we're asking or when people are willing to get sober, like helping them get to the root cause. Because if we don't address the root cause emotionally and psychologically that drove them there, right? Like it's like taking a 2-year-old's pacifier away and just asking them to self-soothe. And it's like, no, like, you got to help me out. Like nobody wants to be that way or live that life.
No.
It's just the best coping mechanisms they could come up with. And so I think it's very compassionate to just help them on that journey and to be like, let's resolve these root causes that drove you there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, so on the that subject, I guess now I can't even remember. I think I asked you and we started talking about something else. Was there more you wanted to talk about with the neurotransmitters or go to gut health?
I just wanted to add that when we're talking about that survival mode, and you asked, to get a better understanding of why our kids can't quit, right? Or why they keep making those decisions, is that I also want you to think that when somebody, so the research has shown us that stress, right, can also increase our cravings for things like cocaine. And then when you start to withdraw from cocaine or heroin or any substance for that matter, that's a physical stressor, right? So then your body secretes more cortisol, right? That says, hey, okay, we're definitely still in survival mode. So you're just feeding that cycle of looking for another substance because the cravings are so intense, because the stress is high, but also because the withdrawal from that substance is creating stress.
That is a great point.
Where that cycle comes in. Yeah.
And like the external stressors, like I shared with Heather yesterday, Atomic Habits, and he refers to the study of soldiers in Vietnam and heroin addiction, and how like a huge percentage, I think there was 30% of them, of the soldiers in Vietnam that were addicted to heroin while they were there. And when they came back home, only like a very small percent went back to heroin.
Yeah.
And it's because they're
like 10%, I think.
Yeah, their environmental triggers were removed.
Yeah.
And that's like, and he used the story of like smoking. So like when you're like driving, that can be a trigger for people to smoke. Because the brain's like, oh, we're driving again. We smoke when we drive.
Right. It becomes a habit.
Yeah, like when I quit smoking cigarettes, that was one of my harder ones to give up, was smoking when I was driving. That's probably the hardest one.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have these triggers, and I mean, it's the same thing with our kids. And when they've been using the things, I mean, tin foil can be a trigger. Like something that we use to cook with every day, like, so there's so many things that we use in everyday life that can be huge triggers to them in their addiction. So they have a lot to overcome when they're trying to get sober.
And it's not like, because I can hear my critical self argue like, well, they should just be mentally strong enough to like overcome these triggers. But when they're triggered, it's not like an emotional trigger, like seeing tenfold. It's not like, oh wow. It's a trigger physiologically because it triggers the cascade of chemicals. it subconsciously in the brain and says, oh, this is what I use to do heroin. In that study, he talks about it's 0.33 milliseconds. The brain isn't even recognizing consciously it. Subconsciously it does, and then it triggers the chemical and the cravings for it before they've even realized what's going on. So that's what we're talking about, triggers, people. Okay.
That's a great point, that all of those things are happening before they even have a chance to respond, to override what's happening and get to have clear thoughts. They're already in survival mode, right?
The cravings and the chemicals have already started producing and firing, right?
Yeah. So that is a lot to overcome. And when, it just increases my compassion for what my daughter's in rehab right now. She's been in for, I think, 4 weeks now. And so, she is just watching the changes in her this time versus last time. I think seeds can be planted, and she's had a much easier time. She was fighting it very hard for like the first 40 days, really fighting it every day. And now here she is really like actually enjoying parts of it, which is something we were laughing about yesterday that we never thought we would see happen. And so even though we're talking about how hard this is, so that we can have compassion and understand it and go at it from the root cause, that it doesn't mean that it's hopeless either. So I don't want to paint that picture either, because I know that it's easy for us parents to get, we're in this already fight or flight state anyway. So to feel like it's hopeless, but it's not. It's just being armed with all the information is the best way to approach this.
You just got to be intentional. It's not about hopelessness. It's about intentionality.
Yeah.
Right. Education with intentionality for this.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So if we just use that example of external triggers, right? Like the same can be applied, and he talks about it in that book, for positive. So almost if I was your daughter's mom, like I would, like the rehab that she's doing well at, I would go and take pictures of what her room looks like. And I would repaint her room at home and like decorate it to mimic that external trigger. So her brain is associating rehab with getting clean, clearer thinking, right? I can recreate that environment at home, so it's also triggering those same thought processes. Just me.
Yeah, she's actually planning to stay there, so she'll be in the same room. But yeah, I mean, like I have created that for myself as far as positive triggers, like just the act of like putting on my workout clothes gets my brain ready for working out every day. And then getting in the car to drive to the place where I walk, excuse me, I start to feel relaxed, yet also excited about being in that place. I just love it there. So I have all of these positive triggers associated with going there. I can go there and be in the absolute worst mood and do a total 180 because I have trained my brain and my body to respond to going there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like such a great understanding it's a great piece of knowledge to understand, because it's not just people that struggle with addiction to assimilate back in. Now they have all these triggers to overcome. It can be applied to like soldiers trying to assimilate back in to civilian life. We have to help bridge it for them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think supporting somebody in creating those healthy habits. I mean, we can't take it all, but, take it all on for them, but we can support them in a loving way to help them create those healthy habits. Okay, so now do we have anything else about neurotransmitters and stress, or?
I think that wraps that part up. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, at least it gives us a better understanding. There's always more complexity to it, but at least that gives us a foundation, I think. I
I
hope.
think it's a great foundation for where, like, just having enough awareness to be able to create a better support system within a family, because addiction is a family disease and recovery should, happen as a family as well. So, all right, let's talk about gut health then and how that plays into addiction.
Okay. So, we know that our gut is where the majority of our serotonin is produced, anywhere from 60 to 70% of our serotonin. And so serotonin is a neurotransmitter as well that is closely related to dopamine. Our gut also produces dopamine as well. And so if our gut health isn't optimal, then we're not able to produce those transmitters in the proper amounts to to function optimally, right? So if the bacteria are out of balance, right? If we have something called dysbiosis where the gut health is out of balance, then we don't have that foundation in order to produce those neurotransmitters. Okay. Also, on the other side, that stress can negatively affect our gut health as well. Stress can lead to a change in our gut flora, but also can lead to something called leaky gut. As well as, if our diet is more on the processed food side, then we're also creating a situation in which we can't produce those neurotransmitters adequately.
So, what would be an indicator to some, like maybe some of the symptoms that you have poor gut health that you need to look into?
Okay, so it can kind of range as far as gut symptoms, but also systemic symptoms. So things like acid reflux or heartburn that people experience, nausea, vomiting, gas and bloating can be indicators of dysbiosis, or the gut bacteria are not in proper balance. So even if people get bloated after drinking water or eating the smallest meal, that can be a pretty significant sign as far as the bacteria is out of balance. And then, of course, constipation or diarrhea are all signs or symptoms that can be associated with poor gut health. But even systemic things like the inflammation, like headaches, joint aches, right, muscle aches, pains, fatigue, brain fog, all of those can also be associated with poor gut health.
Okay, so that ties into the thought portion as well. But before we go there, I want to know, like, so if somebody suspects that they have poor gut health, what do you recommend that they do?
So the easy first line things is to really look at probiotics. So that's often something that's easy for people to do. You can find probiotics over the counter in most stores these days. I do prefer a good probiotic, which will have over 20 billion CFUs, or colony forming units, per capsule, and greater than 4 strains of bacteria. So if you read the label and it has more than 4 names of bacteria, then you know you're buying a good product. Yeah. So that's something that's easy that we can do.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
that's good.
Another thing is increasing our fiber, right? We hear a lot about fiber, but sometimes that's all we hear about. It's like, you should eat more fiber, you should eat more fiber. What does that look like? What does that mean? So I tell folks, I give them a goal of 25 to 35 grams of fiber a day. I prefer that in fruits and vegetables, but you can also do that in over-the-counter supplement as well. The fiber helps to feed the bacteria so that once you repopulate with the probiotic, it can flourish, right? And it also helps with, if there's a leaky gut picture, fiber can be really helpful. It also helps with elimination and waste. So we know that as part of the gut health also includes the liver, and the liver is our biggest detox, as one of the main players in our detoxification pathway. And so that means we have to detox from medications, environmental things. We also have to detox from drugs. So fiber is a real helpful thing that's easy that we can add or increase in our diet to help with elimination of waste, but also with our detox process.
Okay. And something, excuse me, that I found to be like, when you were talking in the podcast on the Thrive and Aligned Healing podcast about how thoughts play into what that creates in your body and how that can affect your gut health as well. Well, before we go there, is there anything else you want to add about gut health and addiction?
I would stick with those things as my frontline things. Yeah.
Okay.
To add.
Okay. So what I heard you guys say, which, I talk about, and, Kim follows the same logic, that our thoughts create our feelings. Like, we have a thought, it releases the chemical that creates the feeling that we feel in our body. But they took it a little bit further on their podcast and were talking about how the actual different effect on our body with a positive thought versus a negative thought. So do you want to explain the different effects that positive and negative thoughts have on our bodies?
Sure. So within that spectrum of what we would consider positive and negative thoughts, right? We can see that relationship in that those thoughts are on the negative side, actually increase our acidity within our body. So they actually increase those negative ions, which increases our acidity. So if you've ever heard of like an alkaline diet or an acidic diet, you can get that with food as well, but just our emotions can create that environment within our body. So more acidity leads to inflammation, right? So inflammation can also affect our gut health, but it can also affect our whole body. That's where we see again the brain fog. You experience those aches and pains. You can, if it's progressive, it can lead to things, chronic disease that's associated with inflammation, like diabetes or high blood pressure. Those negative thoughts can be a root cause to those bigger, more chronic inflammatory illnesses.
Okay, that's so important, because I've talked about before how I used to try to numb all of my negative feelings. And as a side effect of that, like, I had all kinds of pain in my body, physical pain that was unexplained. There was no reason for it. I was sick all of the time. And so I started actually feeling my negative emotions and processing them. And I no longer experience those physical symptoms anymore. So, what is the difference there? Because so negative emotions are important, and we do need to have them so that we can and process them. Like, we would choose certain, like, so-called negative responses to things that happen in our life. But what's the balance there of how, I'm wondering, like, why suppressing them would cause all of those problems versus I'm still having the negative thoughts, but I'm processing them. I guess they're just not getting stuck in your body.
Can I answer this one, Carmen?
Please.
So we got to backtrack to the T line, to the thought line.
Okay.
Right. So you're talking about processing emotion versus feeling emotion. It's not necessarily about that. We have to go back to the T line, to the thought line. it's negative thought loops.
Yes.
Right? Like you can process the emotion from your negative thought loops every day, but you're not getting rid of the negative thought loop.
Yeah.
It's that negative perception of the world. It's that victim mentality, right? It's these belief systems that are rooted in negative feelings that you're cycling over and over and over.
So it's the chronic nature of the negative thought loops versus, which was, since I was buffering and stuffing my feelings down and keeping that in my subconscious, whether you're aware of it or not, those things are happening if you're feeling the emotions in your body. And what Kim said of feeling versus processing, when you're in chronic constant anxiety, you're feeling anxiety versus processing through it and figuring out what the root cause is and working through that. So that's I think a great thing to point out, the difference of feeling it versus processing it and letting it go. So now when I have a negative thought, I'm very aware of the thought that's creating the feeling, and I process through it, decide how I want to handle it, what I want to think instead, or even just see my choice in, okay, I want to continue with that thought, understanding that it is a choice, which also has a completely different energy than feeling like we have no choice or power or control in the situation.
Yep. So it's like staying in victim mentality where I have no power and control. And so all my perceptions of the world are from basically a negative, the world's after me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned that negative feelings or thoughts and feelings can cause inflammation. And, it's interesting to think about how if we try to, like, if somebody's on a diet trying to eliminate inflammation and walking or exercising or something like that, but they're still in these chronic negative thoughts, they're not going to experience the same level of relief as somebody who's getting like all of the angles of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then I just wanted to make sure that we covered that because I'm always talking about how important it is to feel your negative feelings and process them and understand them. So I don't want people to think like, oh my gosh, every negative feeling is going to have this horrible consequence in my body. That's not the case. If we're processing things and we're monitoring our thoughts and working through them, and we're not just in this negative ruminating thought loop all of the time, then we don't have to worry about getting stuck in this acidic state, right?
Right. It's that chronic exposure. Exactly. And I mean, our body's always compensating, right? So we're always changing. Very rarely is our body stagnant or always in the same place. So it can be very reactive, right? Yeah. So as you process those feelings and work through them and are letting go of things, then that acidic state is transient, right? So then it's not causing this chronic inflammatory state. Yes.
And then working on our positive thoughts can also help offset that too. So we have to really make sure that, I think in our society, we get so focused on physical health. And as long as we're eating right and exercising, then we're going to have great physical health. But we leave out that mental health component and really how important our thoughts are and how they really play an effect on our overall quality of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, is there anything else that you guys want to add? We have covered some amazing information, so I don't want to go put anybody into information overload, but if there's anything important that we didn't cover yet, is there anything either of you want to bring up?
I think we
No?
covered it.
Okay. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of great information. So, I think that's a good place to end today. Do you guys want to tell everybody how they can get a hold of you in case they want to find out more about what you offer?
Okay. So you can, as a team, you can find us at thriveandalignedhealing.com. We also have a podcast like Heather mentioned. And then for just my coaching work, you can find me on Instagram at Kimberly Jarman Coaching.
For my information, you can look me up at drcarmenjones.com or on Facebook at Dr. Carmen Jones as well for holistic naturopathic care.
All right. Thank you guys so much for being on today. This information that you shared was, to me, it's life-changing knowledge and is really going to help a lot of people. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on today and share that with me and my audience. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. And I'll be back next week with some more exciting information. Bye.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it 2 different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.